it's a pleasure, as everybody kind of says when they start lectures. But it is actually really enjoyable to spend a few hours this morning with Helena, her colleagues, at a small studio. I think of all the design practices that I've sort of been familiar with, worked with a little bit. I think it's impressive interdisciplinary work that you guys undertake. And I think the project around the high street is extremely important that you're doing with Station to Station. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for everybody else for joining. I think Helena's given a fairly, a fairly sort of broad, clear introduction to myself. So I think that I don't need to talk too much about myself, but I'll just show a couple of, let's see if I can get this to work, a couple of slides of my background. So for those of you who don't know me and kind of are a little bit unclear about what I'm going to talk about and where I'm coming from, see if I can get my slides to work. There we go. I trained in landscape architecture originally, and I think that as many of us do in landscape architecture, we find ourselves working in the spaces between buildings, outdoor spaces open to the sky, as Catherine Gustafsson describes. And after a few years practicing on projects like this in the north of England, designing squares and streets and public spaces, I recognized, I suppose, a certain frustration in myself that landscape was confined to outdoor spaces. And when we think about cities, when we think about high streets as well, there's more to the space than just the outdoor space. And I began to feel that the relationships between what's happening outside, what's happening inside, were more important than either of these spaces individually, whether the space of the architect or the space of the landscape architect or that of the engineer. So I studied urban design in New York City with the intention, let's say, of broadening my understanding of design and that of cities, and worked for a few years in New York. And I think that maybe this is more about myself than it is about landscape architecture, urban design. But after a few years, I think I felt that I was reaching the limits of what I could do within the commercial practice or arena that I was working within, and sort of began to be more interested in experimenting with ideas, both theoretically but also practically. And I started to do my own design work, set up a much smaller studio than Helena's, really to do experimental sort of testing of ideas work, alongside working in academia, originally in Kingston, now in Greenwich, and two other roles that Helena's described. And as I very much enjoy, let's say, this kind of interplay between working with students, developing ideas, exploring ideas with them, while doing some design work and also exploring ideas in writing. And I think within this time, I realized that I think really the thing I learned the most is the importance of being able to communicate through words as well as through drawings. I think as designers, we often communicate well through drawings, but we sometimes forget that words are also important. So if I want to, let's say, kick off with, and I apologize to those of you in the seminar who know me and who kind of are familiar with the tired old questions I ask. But I wanted to, let's say, flag up a few questions which I think are important for us to ask continuously, whether we are working in the fields that I'm in or not. But I think also it's important to question our own preconceptions about what landscape is and what the high street is and what the city is. So firstly, what is landscape is, I suppose, a question which I continuously ask myself and which I would aim to ask our students. And I often use the Patrick Geddes valley section sort of diagram drawings as a way to both explore and also try to explain how I would frame landscape, how I would argue landscape to exist. Patrick Geddes trained as a botanist in Scotland, then England. Don't know whether he ever graduated. I think it's probably the sign of great people who She don't graduate from the degrees. But he moved from botany and what he understood about the relationships between plants, animals, habitats, to work as an urban planner and explore ideas of urbanization. And this is sort of, the drawing on the right hand side is an early valley section drawing. This is a later one in 1905 that he developed, which is really about showing the relationship between physical landscapes as we understand in the valley, the people who work these landscapes are shown in these little figures of the fisherman, the hunter, the woodsman, and then the tools that are used by these people to transform these landscapes. So this is a sort of a drawing for me of relationships. And if I was to have to, I suppose, pin down a single definition of landscape, it would be one that recognizes the relationships between people and the worlds around them, and very much in the plural. Landscape doesn't exist, I would argue, as a sort of an individual relationship. It exists as a multiplicity. It also exists as relationships between us, the worlds around us, but that includes the many people and things and beings in the world around us. I find that the valley section drawing throws up a series of questions for our contemporary thinking and our contemporary worlds. And the first is, what would the valley section drawing be if we were to draw it in 2020, or draw it in 10 years time, when many of, let's say, the design projects that we work on take decades to be built? What would the physical landscapes be that Patrick Geddes would draw? What would take the place of the rivers and the fields and the towns? Would these be gated communities, megacities, regions? Would this be the monsoon, as we see colleagues in University of Westminster exploring in their work? Also, who are the beings? Can you see my cursor? Yeah. Who would be these people? In 1905, Patrick Geddes is assuming that only men are working. And we're seeing obscured the work, domestic work inside of houses. We're seeing obscured the work of non-humans, of animals working within these landscapes. And I think that, and the idea that the things doing the work are just people, we also have to question. We can also look in our contemporary lives to other tools that are being employed, other tools that are being used to work these landscapes, whether these are iPhones or machines, but also recognizing that people are used and animals are used and exploited within many of the landscapes that we live in and understand in the contemporary world. Kind of the fourth aspect of the valley section drawing, which I think is maybe potentially even the most important, are the things that we don't see within the drawing. There's a history of landscape, let's say theories of landscape, that criticize landscape for obscuring reality, that it shows a picture of something, but by showing a picture of one thing, it obscures many others. And within the valley section drawing, we're not seeing many of the structures of power that also come to play in the making of landscape, whether these are terms of ownership, whether these are particular work relations, whether these are issues of climate change. And I think that many of, let's say, the things which aren't presented in drawings are the things which maybe we should be questioning the most. I think it's also when we think about, or when I think about landscape, I often think about how it is defined in contrast to buildings, let's say. So people talk about buildings and then they look out the window and they say that is landscape. But they look at the city and they say outside the city is landscape. And I think that when we look at the 1909 drawing by Patrick Geddes, again, so he's continuously exploring this idea of the valley section. We see a move away from the individual city as the center of the region. And we see a number of points of urbanization. As we use my little cursor here to see that the biggest city by the coast, the town, the village, the hamlet, all the way up into the mountains, we've seen these points of urbanization. And I think it's important for us, I think, to recognize that the city is a contested thing. Different people will think about cities in different ways and define them in different ways, whether that's through the existence of a cathedral, whether that's through the existence of a particular population, whether it's through contrast to the surroundings. And I think it's much more interesting to think about the city as a process and the way in which we think about landscape relationally. The city being a process of making and remaking, a place, a thing that is constantly in flux and being transformed also through people's changing definitions. It was an interesting, let's say, question that Helena posed to me in inviting me to, let's say, present some of my thoughts today in relation to the high street. And it's not, let's say, a spatial typology, let's say, or a landscape typology that I often would think about. But I think for me, the high street comes in some way to beginning to define central points in cities and towns. But I think also we can look at the high street as being a landscape in itself. This is, I think, the last slide of Patrick Getty. So this isn't a history lesson, please. My knowledge of history is limited, so this is maybe the end of the lesson. But Patrick Getty, in his work looking at the valley section, he began to explore how he could translate his understanding of the region, the valley region, to the high street. And we see the top drawing being the fairly detailed illustrated valley section, and below that being the drawing of the high street. And for me, I think there's a very clear argument that the high street is a landscape. It's a landscape of buildings, it's a landscape of businesses, of shops, of people, of residences. The high street is not an architectural thing. It's a kind of socio-spatial coming together of many things and many relationships, which are much more complex than I think we could understand purely from our professions as landscape architects, as urban designers, as architects. And I think it maybe also points to the great work that a small studio are doing in bringing together many different disciplines and stakeholders in discussing what the high street is. I think that we recognize, I think I recognize very much in this drawing, if I understand correctly, this is a student drawing of a street in China, the limits of the section as a way to explore the high street. And here I think this is a drawing which I reference quite a lot because we begin to see the multiple ways of looking at the street. So the elevations of the edge of the street, we see the plan view looking down from above as the planner or the urban designer might do. But we also see the photographs of the details along the street. And I think it's important for us to understand the kind of different scales, these different details of the high street. And it's something which I think that the artist Larissa Fasten does extraordinarily well. And if any of you don't know her work, I do recommend that you have a look at it. She spends a lot of her time going to places, studying places, speaking with people, and drawing these dense, or developing these dense ethnographic drawings, which pick up sort of architectural and spatial details, but also details of shops and interactions and people and conversations. And within the journal, the Architectural Design Journal, which I guest edited, it's a great article by Toya Peel exploring the work of Larissa Fasten. And I think it's for me, let's say, this exploration of streets, of high streets, of landscapes, is something which I think is extremely valuable from a creative perspective. And it's something which within my own work, I suppose I've attempted to do to try to think about what the Patrick Getty's Valley section means to us today, to very particular places, how we can understand the many issues at play within the contemporary landscape. Helena, before I move to part 2 of my talk, how long do you want me to speak for? We should have talked about this before.
Ed, I think we've set an hour aside today as an event, and if you want to speak for another 15, 20 minutes, we should be on track and okay. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, perfect. I'll probably be about 15 minutes. Thank you. So thinking about our contemporary situation, I don't think there's many of us who haven't thought about, many of us haven't thought about the implications on our environment due to the coronavirus pandemic, the various lockdowns that we've been under in our different cities, our different countries around the world. And I think it is quite fascinating to think about how this comes, kind of plays out within our spatial environments. This map by Esri, which is a sort of a digital mapping company, highlights the limits to the pavements, the sidewalks, the footpaths of London in the context of social distancing. What we see within this drawing is that only about 30% of the pavements across Greater London are able to accommodate a social distancing or physical distancing of 2 meters. I think that we see the limits of the availability of land, the availability of physical space. And I think this raises really interesting questions for streets, really interesting questions for architecture, for landscape. And I think also for politicians and advisors to the government in the practical response of people, of businesses, to many of the expectations that are put in front of us. I think when we think about many of the restaurants and pubs that are currently closed in London, we anticipate them opening up. I think there's serious questions over how they are able to open up and what we're able to do as planners, as designers, as politicians to begin to accommodate and address some of these challenges. I was cycling through Borough High Street day before yesterday and saw a sign very similar to this, which was pointing out that certain lanes of the road have been closed to accommodate a wider pavement or a wider sidewalk. And immediately some towns, villages, and cities have been trying to address, let's say, the challenge of the lack of space available along the pavements. I think that there's really interesting opportunities when we're thinking about streets, we're thinking about the current coronavirus, the limitations on space, to think about a sort of a longer term future for cities that is about taking back some of the space that has been occupied by private uses such as driving private vehicles, and thinking about how these spaces that have been privatized for various means can be collectivized again, how they could be taken back and rethought for a wider public. And I don't necessarily want to get into, let's say, the arguments around private space versus public space, but I do think that we can recognize that there is a need for physical space for particular numbers of the population, particular densities of cities. We can begin to think about how the speed of high streets, the speed of vehicles, can begin to be rethought if we're to accommodate greater numbers of cyclists on roads. We can begin to think about narrowing some roadways, closing down lanes of the roadways. And there's what I think is really important to recognize, I think, which is recognized or is being recognized in cities like London, is that there's great precedent, and there's already a lot of great examples around the world of very dramatic closing down of streets, closing down of car space to accommodate people, accommodate groups of people, public spaces, social interactions. This is a slide from the urban designers at Gell and the great work they've done in New York City. And much of this work began just by placing bollards, closing down streets with planters to test out how space can be given back to people on footpaths. I think it's important to recognize that much of this work comes from, let's say, more utopian aspirations from designers such as Michael Sorkin, one of my beloved professors from New York, who has set out numbers of projects which are about trying to appropriate space within cities for greater collective means. The idea of planting a tree at a road intersection both addresses issues of, or could address issues of pollution, but also begin to think about how cars become dominant or have become dominant within our urban fabric. But within this small collage that Michael Sorkin developed, it's part of a much wider master plans, the East New York master plan study that he undertook, which was looking at street intersections, but it was also looking at the wider sort of network of spaces, whether these are buildings, open spaces, private gardens, how we can connect and make accessible some of the spaces that we hold quite dear to ourselves. I have a little garden outside the back of my flat, which isn't actually my garden. It's actually owned by the various people who own the building, but there's only one way to access it, which is through my flat. So therefore it becomes my garden. I begin to think, okay, what would happen if we took down and challenged the walls that separate my garden from my neighbor's garden, and begin to think about the back gardens as a collective space in which we can share both with our neighbors on the ground floor, but potentially with very small architectural interventions, begin to allow my upstairs neighbors who haven't had any access to open space during the shutdown to begin to access some of these really important resources within cities such as London. I think also beginning to think about the use of our front gardens. My neighbors to the right, they have a back garden, but actually they use their front garden to have their dinner, sit outside, and engage with their friends and their neighbors in a way in which they've never done before. And I think both the front garden has an opportunity to become an extension of the living room, or a rethinking of the living room, and a rethinking of our relationship with people who are outside of our families, and a means in which we can begin to provide space for people who don't have gardens. I think I sometimes think that the conversations around streets and around space are limited to, I suppose, us within an architectural conversation. And this article that was published in The Guardian in the middle of April, for me, sort of pointed to the fact that these aren't conversations just happening within the architectural world. The importance of opening up green and public space to a wider public is highlighted here in the work of professors Stephen Riker and Susan Michie, who are current advisors to the SAGE group, which is, I suppose, the government advisory group, who are kind of central to the advice the government are getting on the coronavirus. They're actively promoting the appropriation of private space, private gardens, private playgrounds, to be able to be accessed by the public as a public health issue, not as one which is an architectural issue or a democratic issue, but as one of which is based around making healthy places for people, large parts of the population who don't have gardens, don't have access to parks or playgrounds. We can recognize that even before the coronavirus, the distribution of beautiful, well-maintained parks is uneven in our cities. Living in New York City, we see people who live along the edges of Central Park have amazing access to a resource which isn't available to people living in Upper Manhattan or even in Lower Manhattan. And we see similarly in cities like London, cities all around the world, it's an even distribution of public green space. If we are to address this, there needs to be a rethinking of the allocation and distribution of space. And I think that there's a number of ways in which we can go about appropriating space. And I wrote a small article for the Landscape Research Group blog a few weeks ago, kind of pulling out some of these ideas. And we can immediately look at the appropriation and the occupation of space. In 2011, the Occupy protests around the world challenging our governments and their response to the economic crash and handling of the economic situation at the time. And we can look at the various formations of space. The Occupy protests in Madrid, in Puerto del Sol, they won a sort of architectural urban design prize for their inventive appropriation and restructuring of public space. But we could also look at the Extinction Rebellion protests that have been happening, and the creative use of space, the creative occupation, the creative kind of blocking of space, both to make statements, but also to address some of the issues at hand. In the closing down of the streets during the Occupy protests last year, there was a significant reduction in air pollution across London, allowing us to see, let's say, an immediate impact and an immediate addressing of environmental concerns through the taking back of space, which is being, I suppose, dominated by the private use of cars, of automobiles. But we also have to recognize that there is also legal mechanisms that are in place already for us to take back private space. And these mechanisms are used day in, day out, and they're increasingly used by governments, by local authorities, by private developers to take private property off people for the purpose of the greater good. I'm paraphrasing planning documentation here. But and this is a slide of leaseholders, people who owned flats in the Haygate estate in South London that has subsequently been demolished. And many of these leaseholders, they had their flats taken from them against their wishes. And they were, most of these residents have been displaced to other parts of England, the southeast. And what we see are mechanisms of what's called compulsory purchase, particular planning acts being used to redistribute land. In this case, it's to facilitate private developers regenerating an area of South London. But I would argue the appropriation of land to create more public spaces, more collective spaces, seems like a more democratic use of such planning mechanisms. I think that there are great opportunities for us to intelligently look at the planning system as it exists and to employ many of the planning acts as they're set out for a greater good. I'm going to finish by showing 3 slides from a project that one of our students did at the University of Greenwich on the landscape architecture program, to point to the importance, I think, of creative, inventive, and this may mean landscape architecture discourses in rethinking our cities. And I think while I'm very interested in the interdisciplinary nature and the non-professional, let's say, solutions that we can come up with, I think there's something great that design professions offer in rethinking our city. This is Deptford High Street in southeast London, near Greenwich. And this is a project by Max Barnes, who graduated a few years ago, now works out west, I think, for LDA Design, if I remember correctly. And he was studying Deptford, as many of the students were that year, and he identified that there was an object that had been removed from the high street in Deptford and taken and placed for some reason in a private developer's yard. I'll show you where. It's the private development, Convoy's Wharf. And the thing that was taken was an anchor. It was a historic object that marks maybe the history of this part of London, shipbuilding history, the maritime history of Deptford. And he recognized the local movement to have this anchor return to its place on the high street. And Max did a study of the high street, did a study of the area, thought through some of the, the larger and longer histories around shipbuilding and colonial acts related to shipbuilding in the UK. And he proposed a project which was taking back the anchor, but it wasn't one which we take back the anchor in some type of passive way of hiring a truck and taking the anchor and putting it back on the high street. But it's one in which he proposed people would both symbolically but also practically get together and drag this anchor from its place in this private development back up through the high street to the place where the local people wanted it. And through this act of appropriation, of dragging the anchor, Max reimagined the high street as a place that was ripped up, that was disrupted, and the vehicle-dominated environment of Deptford High Street was broken up to open up a place of, I don't know, planting, of water, of maybe people's traditional views of landscape, but a landscape that creates place for collective action, which is also the result of collective action, and one which maybe rebalances a gradual, maybe it's not a gradual, but a change of common and collective spaces in cities like London to those of private space, taking and reversing some of those processes. I'd like to finish just there, but finish with reading a quote from the anthropologist and artist Barbara Bender, who wrote in her book Landscape and Politics that landscape is never inert. People engage with it, they rework it, they appropriate it and contest it. And I think that if there's one quote about landscape, which I think I would like to share with people, it would be that was something which, and it should be created. Thank you very much. Can we have an applause?
Thank you, Ed. You've told us never to applause in student presentations, so we're going to throw this one back at you.
Absolutely, absolutely.